It's 8:03, and I'm delighted to be joined by Samuel Kasumu, former advisor to Boris Johnson. He worked in Number 10, did a lot of very important work there, particularly around vaccines at that particular time, but also more generally working with Boris Johnson on a range of issues, particularly appealing to ethnic minority communities as well. And he's written this very interesting book, which I've gone through this week, actually. It's hot off the press. It's only been published a week ago, and it's entitled The Power of the Outsider. And I'm holding it up to the camera if you're watching on Global Player so you can get a good look at it. I recommend you buy it because I love outsiders. Any of you who listen to the show regularly or my weekend shows will know that I'm a particular fan of contrarians, people who go against the grain and challenge the orthodoxy. So I'm delighted, Samuel, that you're here. Before we get into the book, and there's a lot to unpick there, I just wanted to ask you about this news that broke hot off the press. And thank you for sending your letter to the party chairman, the Conservative Party chairman, just before we came on air. Your timing is impeccable. What's this about, Samuel? We know that there were 3 candidates for the London mayoral contest. One of them, Dan Korski, has pulled out after allegations of sexual impropriety going back some years. He's saying it was a distraction for the Conservative Party, so he's pulled out. There are 2 people left, Moz Hussain and Susan Hall. And you yourself wanted to be a candidate in that race. What have you written to the party chairman about?
Yeah, I think that it has been well documented that there were some concerns around the whole selection process for the Conservative Party when it comes to trying to get a good candidate forward, or the best candidate forward, to take on Sadiq Khan next year. And my view is that it is in the best interest of the party, and more importantly London, that we make sure that there is a process that is open, transparent, fair, and results in the best possible candidate being put forward. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean that is me, or that I would be putting myself forward if the contest was reopened. But I think it's an important thing to do. Because
you were referring to the fact that the London board had chosen the candidates before rather than all the party members. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we ended up with a shortlist that didn't include, of course, the Minister for London, didn't include myself.
Who you're having a spat with at the moment, Paul Scully.
We've kissed and made up.
Oh, so, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
And it didn't include myself. And whatever people think of me, I was the candidate with the most high-profile backers, the most traction in the media, the clearest proposition, and I wasn't even afforded the opportunity to put myself forward for interview.
Wait, Sam, you say you had a high-profile backers because you had Nadeem Zahawi, if I'm not mistaken, and also Grant Shapps.
Yep, 2 former party chairmen.
Right. So why do you think it was that you weren't shortlisted?
I mean, a number of reasons. Some people said to me, Samuel, the issue is that you don't sound like a politician. Others said to me, Samuel...
That's a virtue, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you said it. Some people said, Samuel, you didn't attend some of the dinners that some of the other candidates attended.
Naughty.
I mean, my response was, of course, I would have come to the dinners. I love good food just like anybody else. But I wasn't invited, nor did I know about any of these dinners because, of course, I'm an outsider. And so there were, the reasons that were given to me, bluntly, were just not good enough.
Well, you see, that's very interesting that you mention things like the dinners and these soft social things that come in when it comes to these type of selections. And we all know how these things work. And you bring out some of these things in the book. Now, it's a fascinating book. And I wanted to begin by asking you, what made you write it?
Yeah, so when I was in Downing Street, I entered in the summer of 2019 with Boris Johnson, and unlike many of my peers at the time, I didn't study at Oxford, Cambridge before. I wasn't part of the Vote Leave set that Boris Johnson ran or led. I didn't work with Boris Johnson when he was in City Hall. I wasn't a legacy hire from a previous Number 10 administration. So I very much entered that building as an outsider. Now, being in Downing Street, there's no time to reflect on that because, as you said, we had to deal with the vaccines. Before that, the coronavirus pandemic. Before that, we had a general election. Before that, Boris and co needed to, get Brexit done. So there was no time to really reflect on my experiences. But once I left, I had a chance to really look back and I thought to myself, my experience was quite unique, but also there was a lot of learnings that I needed to unpack to make sure that, not just myself, but other people who feel like outsiders are able to fully flourish within environments where they might be one of few.
Well, you said, for example, the Oxbridge background, people who've been to Oxford and Cambridge, and you didn't go there. And you also mentioned in the book some very interesting little anecdotes about the fact that you went to a dinner once, a black tie event, and you took your jacket off because it was hot.
Yep.
And then someone said to you, he admonished you, a friend of yours, saying you shouldn't have taken off before the loyal toast.
Yeah.
Things like this. I mean, and also, you also mentioned the fact that people have these little chats about which Oxbridge College they went to, and it's all very cosy. But how does that feel as an outsider? And is this part of the problem that these unwritten social norms that are touted around make it very difficult for people to break into these circles?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, there's nothing wrong with aspiration, and there's nothing wrong with people going to Oxford or Cambridge. And also, I don't think we should condemn people for any privileges that they are born with or given as a result of their background, right? I don't think we want to live in that kind of world.
No, I agree with that.
But the vast majority of the people in this country have, I guess, relatively ordinary experiences that I think should be represented where decisions are being made. And so when you end up in a space like that, where though you represent the majority, you are a minority, it's quite important that you know how to flourish, but also important that those who are in those spaces recognise the value that you bring, hence the term the power of the outsider.
Now, you in the book, you also talk about the different types of outsiders. Now, you yourself, Samuel, you talk about your background, you talk about your siblings, you talk about being brought up by a single parent. I think your parents separated when they were 6. But you now, I mean, you're a well-in counsellor, you have been an advisor. You've become an insider now, but what makes an outsider? What kind of outsiders are we talking about? Because you sort of go through different types.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because you can be an outsider based on objective facts. Maybe you look different, or you're a different gender, or what have you. But you can also be an outsider simply because you feel different because of your perspective. And so you could be somebody that looks like everybody else, but because you've experienced trauma or your life experience is slightly different, you could still be an outsider. And then you could be an outsider because you're looking to do something that is quite different. So though, yes, I now have, experiences and relationships with people within the so-called establishment, I'm very much still viewed as an outsider because I'm constantly challenging orthodoxy, constantly saying we've got to do things differently, and not everybody likes it.
But you've got to be quite brave, haven't you? It can be quite a lonely place if you're a member of the awkward squad, if you like to put it that way. I mean, I love people who are, because that's the way progress is made, but it's not everyone's cup of tea.
Oh, totally. Even just now, just before you went on the show, a Conservative councillor from Croydon sent me some abuse via Twitter just because I was saying, look, we've got to do better.
I wouldn't worry. That's probably a badge of honour. I wouldn't worry about that.
Apparently, if you don't have enemies, you're not doing something right.
Indeed. Now, you also talk about the fact that as an outsider, you have to work harder than other people and be held to a higher standard. Is that something that you felt personally in your journey? Because before this, you did social entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. You tried to help graduates coming out get jobs. You did various things before you went into government. But have you found this in your own experience?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, I put myself forward to be the Conservative mayoral candidate. I wasn't even given the opportunity to interview, despite all of the things on the table that demonstrated that I was at least good enough to be heard. So why do you think that is? It's because I'm an outsider and people felt like they had a right to dismiss me. And so there are times when you have to make sure that you are better than the best just to have the right to be heard. Now, is that the way that the world should be? Certainly not. I think the world can do better if they recognise the value that outsiders bring.
Now, I wanted to ask you also a little bit about your resignation, because in the book you don't go into it in that much detail, but I've read about it a little bit. But I wanted to just understand from you, because initially you thought about leaving Downing Street in February 2021, and then it took another few months, because I think Nadeem Zahawi, who was party chairman at the time, he was vaccines minister.
Yes.
He convinced you to stay because you're doing a lot of good work around the vaccine and helping ethnic minorities take up of the vaccine. So it's a very important role that you were playing, but then you left a few months later. What was the trigger that led to that resignation?
Yeah, I mean, I've never really spoken about that in public because I've always felt like it's important to try to look forward, and I have nothing personally against anyone that was involved in the situation that led to my resignation. But at the time, I think I was going through a lot, which I talk about in the book, internally. And there was a lot happening behind the scenes, not necessarily in Downing Street, but in terms of, dealing with all the pressures of being a special advisor and the pressures that you have outside of work. And then, of course, a journalist went through an experience that was not necessarily positive with a minister. I felt like...
And that minister, just to be clear for people who don't know, was Kemi Badenoch. I mean, you don't want to say it, I understand, but I will. But that was the case.
Yeah,
right?
And I think my issue wasn't necessarily that a minister makes a mistake.
No.
We're all human, we all make mistakes. My issue was that nobody was keen to uphold or remind people of standards.
And this journalist was asking questions about the vaccine. Well, what was the issue?
Yeah,
briefly.
I think she was asking why a minister wasn't involved in one of the campaigns that we were running.
Right, I understand. Okay, and then this minister acted in a certain way which you felt was a put down to this journalist, and you felt that journalist, had they been anyone else, would have not had the same treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like if that was Laura Kuenssberg, Peston or Andrew Neil, they wouldn't have been treated in the same way.
Samuel, why was it such an important thing for you, given the fact that you'd worked hard to get where you'd got, and frankly, it's very difficult to get into Downing Street for anyone, quite honestly. And, it's a very pressurized environment, but you were there in the belly of the beast. And you gave that up on this. And for you, it seems to be an issue of principle. Why did it matter so much to you that you felt that you were going to sacrifice your career because a journalist had been treated in a way that you felt was not appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question because I think a lot of people in politics, a lot of my colleagues, conservative colleagues, just do not understand me. They don't understand how I'm wired. They think that, surely you must be ambitious and all of the things that you want to do in politics must be because you want to one day become a Secretary of State or what have you. But what they don't understand is I came into public life to give a voice to people from backgrounds like myself. And so when I saw that there was somebody with a similar background to myself who was mistreated, it did something to me inside, and I felt like I had to respond to it.
And when you say backgrounds like yourself, what do you mean?
Well, people from working class backgrounds, people from minority ethnic groups.
Because your parents were from Nigeria.
Yeah.
Your mother's British Nigerian and your father was from Nigeria.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, and just people in general that might
people from Barnet. You grew up in Barnet.
Yeah, people from Barnet,
lovely
especially.
place, by the way.
Best place in the world.
Indeed.
Best place in the world. Yeah. So just people from backgrounds where they might not find themselves in a position of power. Those are the people that I'm really fighting for. And right now, to be honest with you, young people and generations that are trapped outside of the housing market, which we might talk about later. My mission in politics is to give a voice to the unheard, not to climb the greasy pole.
You also seem to be quite concerned before your resignation, Samuel, as I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, around the fact that the Conservative Party was having at least a tendency to stoke culture wars. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people feel like to win elections, you have to create wedge issues where you can divide groups and as a result, find ways to get enough people to vote for you to win. And I don't think that is the only way. In fact, I think history would tell us that the people that win elections are able to have universal appeal. When we won in 2019, we said we wanted to get Brexit done. Even if you voted Remain, you would have been a bit tired of banging on about Brexit. But also, we were talking about the NHS, crime, etc.
So what are the wedge issues do you think that the party's using which could stoke in a culture war?
I think there are issues that we will discuss if some of your callers ask those questions.
Okay, very, very. I think a political future awaits, Samuel. That's all I can say. Beautifully dodged there. I'm in conversation with Samuel Kasumu, who is Boris Johnson's former advisor. He's done a lot of other things in his life as well. He's run his own. What's it, an NGO or a charity? Or
run social enterprise.
A social enterprise to help graduates get into jobs as well. So he's got a wealth of experience. He was also a student leader as well in his youth as well when he was at Brunel University. I didn't mention that earlier. And he's written this book, a fascinating book, The Power of the Outsider. So we're discussing that. And we're also, just so you know, he wants to be Mayor of London. He was hoping to be on the Tory shortlist. He didn't make it, but the whole entire process might have to be rerun, given the fact they've only got two candidates. And maybe Samuel will be a candidate. I don't know. So you might want to ask him about not only his book, but his experience in government, but also his views on London, why he wanted to be Mayor of London, what he thinks London should be done in London to improve the city, a whole host of things you can ask Samuel. Feel free to call in now, 0345 6060 973. You can text on 84850, or you can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. And remember that Alexa has always been known as an outsider. You're listening to Ali Miraj on LBC in for Ian Dale. It's 18 past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation, LBC with Ali Miraj.
It's Ali Miraj on LBC in for Ian Dale. It's 20 minutes past 8, and I'm in conversation with Samuel Kasumu, who's got this book out, The Power of the Outsider. Samuel was an advisor to Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, right at the heart of number 10 on a whole range of issues, particularly trying to increase appeal to ethnic minority voters, but also playing a pivotal role in the vaccine uptake, again, trying to get people from ethnic minorities to take the actual vaccine. So if you want to ask him a question, and there are plenty to ask, you can call 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, and you can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Samuel, a text has come in saying, Samuel has hit the nail on the head. Every exclusive group of people has gatekeepers who choose who else enters and who is turned away. The reasons they give, many people are not good enough. Being an outsider is good, and we should be proud of our different perspectives. What do you say?
Very well said.
But what do you think about that? Because the thing is, do you think that the system is designed for conformity? One of the things you say in your book is, it is better to be yourself and not to conform. Why is that?
Yeah, because I think that we need to be in a position where people are able to add value in a way that is natural to them, because we know that people who are different have different perspectives. They can challenge orthodoxy, but also they can broaden audiences, and they can inspire others. There's so many good things that outsiders can bring if they're given the opportunity.
You see, I agree with you, because I love outsiders, contrarians, whatever you want to call them, because I think that they're the yeast in the mix and they challenge. But how can you have a parliament or a political system, mayor is slightly different, when you have 650 outsiders in parliament? You never get anything done. You have to whip the system, don't you, to actually get your agenda, your policies through. So you have to, in a certain way, get your people to conform around an agenda that you can pass.
I think collective responsibility is, of course, important. I've been a cabinet member in a district council where we've had to have collective responsibility, but you also have to make sure that there are the spaces for you to have rich, dynamic debate. You also need to be able to demonstrate to the public that you are willing to listen.
Yeah.
And also having that diversity of thought in the room allows you to make better decisions. I'm very, very passionate about social class, because I think that
Well, I'm glad. Why are you passionate about it? Because I think class is very much overlooked as an issue.
I think that because when you don't have people in the room that have had experiences that ordinary people have had, it's very easy for you to miss things, or it's very easy for you to make decisions that might not be in the best interest of the majority. And so, whether we like it or not, our life experiences determine a lot of the things that we choose to do, and also determines the lens that we view the world within.
Okay, Samuel, that's fine. I think it's a fair point. Hassan in Westminster, Eid Mubarak, good evening to you. Hassan.
Eid Mubarak, Ali. Thank you.
What would you like to ask?
London house prices versus income is 11 times, much higher than the UK average of 7 times. If you become mayor, what steps would you take to provide some sort of rent relief or mortgage relief to Londoners, or will you leave it to the mythical free market to sort it out?
Samuel.
I mean, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. I think the first thing to say is, we have a housing crisis in London, and when it's all said and done, at the heart of the reason for that crisis is the lack of supply. We need to build close to 100,000 homes a year to even get to a point where the demand is not met but is relatively stabilized, so prices don't continue to spiral. And so we've got to build more homes, which means that we have to take on some of the establishment figures who are very keen to keep things the way they are. And we have to say, look, yes, we can build beautifully. Yes, we can protect green spaces. But no, we cannot afford to keep things the way they are.
But Samuel, just on that particular point, a lot of people would say, well, that means you've got to build on Greenbelt. You can't have Greenbelt as this holy sacred cow. You have to build on the Greenbelt, and this is being held back. What is your position on building? You represent Welwyn Hatfield as a councillor.
Yep.
I'm sure there's plenty of Greenbelt around Welwyn.
About 80%.
Well, indeed, right. So what is your view?
I think there's a difference between green belt and green spaces. And so I think you should definitely protect green spaces, particularly in London, which is one of the greenest major cities in the world. But the definition of green belt is very, very broad. So there's some car parks that are technically green belt. There's some spaces that are technically employment land that, is a very grey area around what is green belt and what is not.
Okay, so you sound like you'd have a more liberal interpretation around it. You'd be more pragmatic. You'd be prepared to make a distinction between green space and green belt. That's very brave, Samuel, because a lot of Conservative voters, particularly in the outer ring, would be a bit nervous, wouldn't they?
Yeah, totally. I grew up in Barnet, like one of the greenest boroughs in London.
You know it.
And so, but then in Barnet, there are some car parks, right, where it makes a lot of sense to have some homes adjacent to. And so I think you can easily prioritise green building on brownfield land. But it doesn't mean that where there is a challenge, you're not willing to have that conversation.
So let me ask you, because obviously Samuel's given his view, and it's quite revealing actually that he's prepared to be more pragmatic around Greenbelt. That's a revelation to me. But Hassan, obviously the point that you raise is around rents and are also around mortgages as well. Greenbelt and building takes a long time. I mean, do you have a concern that this is all going to take too long? You want to?
I agree. I think it will take long. I think there are lots of hoops that people put up in front of that you have to jump through. And also, I mean, a lot of the housing, will it be social housing or will it be whoever can pay the highest? And then you have people from all over the world buying up key properties and keeping them off market. I think in terms of this looks like a sort of 3-5 year plan or 4-year plan. I mean, there are immediate issues where rents are astronomical. I have nieces who can't afford to live in London. They have to travel huge distances to work, etc. So there needs to do something more immediate. I know house building is the right thing, but that could take a long time.
Yeah, so Samuel, what do you say about that? Is it time for rent controls? Is it what do we do in the short term?
No, I mean, first of all, just like your relatives, I too I was priced out of London, which is part of the reason why I ended up living outside of London. So I completely empathise with this situation. Rent controls are not the answer because the vast majority of landlords are not, large foreign conglomerates. They are people who have put aside some money and have invested in property. And because of the situation we're in with mortgages and the rise in interest rates, if you find yourself in a position where we have rent controls, you're going to end up with a lot of landlords not necessarily being able to pay their mortgages and will have an even deeper crisis. So that is not the answer. What I would agree with is I think we need more social housing. I think we need to have that conversation about how we can get to a point where we're building the social housing we need that will allow future generations
Why hasn't
to save.
happened, Samuel? We keep hearing about this. We've been hearing about this for years.
I think it's the political will. When it's all said and done, it's all about the political will, sending the right signals and bringing together the right stakeholders, using the right capital, both foreign investment, yes, but also the capital available to the Mayor of London. He has a £4 billion budget by Homes England that he's not really used or utilised in an effective way. His own plan, the London plan for homes, doesn't even meet the objectively assessed need. So he's not even planning to build the amount of homes that we need. So when it's all said and done, the political will is paramount here.
Hassan, final word to you.
Look, I think we do need a lot more activist intervention into housing, because housing is not just an investment or a return on capital, it's where people live. And if people keep on getting priced out, then some sort of rent control mechanism, some sort of assistance on the mortgages, because, the interest rate rises have been very painful. And if you have large mortgages, then you're literally sort of losing a very large chunk of your income on mortgages, etc.
Indeed. Hassan, I think the point is well made, and I think it's a constant problem that is just not going away. We talk about housing on this program, Samuel. You would not believe to what extent, because people are really suffering out there, both on the rental side and also homeowners as well, because of rising interest rates on the back of increasing inflation. So I'm with Samuel Kasumu. He is a former advisor to Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister. He's written this new book, which I've been plugging, Samuel. And he hasn't even given me a few bob for that.
Not yet.
No. The Power of the Outsider. It's a riveting read. And we're having a very interesting and fascinating discussion about several aspects, including the fact that Samuel wanted to be Mayor of London. You might want to ask him about London. You might want to ask him about his book, about what does he mean by the power of the outsider? What is he actually alluding to? Why are outsiders important? Who are they? And why does he think he is one himself? Anything that you want to ask, you know what to do. 0345 60 60973. You can text 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj in conversation with Samuel Kasumu. In for Ian Dale at 8:30. The news headlines with Dale Jackson.
Rishi Sunak says he fundamentally disagrees with a legal ruling that the Rwanda deportation scheme is unlawful. The Prime Minister insists he will do whatever is necessary to get the removal flights approved. Violence is continuing in France following the death of a teenager shot by a police officer. There have been further clashes following a peaceful march in Paris. And an inquiry has ruled that the Royal Air Force illegally discriminated against white men in a recruitment drive aimed at boosting diversity. The head of the RAF has apologised unreservedly to all those affected. LBC weather, showers continuing, increasingly confined to the far north of Scotland tonight. Showers also edging into the southwest in the early hours and a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC. Ali Miraj on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
This is Ali Miraj on LBC in for Ian Dale with Samuel Kasumu here in the studio with me discussing his new book, The Power of the Outsider. If you want to discuss that with him, you know what to do, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. And Samuel was an advisor to Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister. Let's go to our next caller, Martin in Wandsworth. Good evening, Martin. Martin, are you there? Hi, go ahead.
Rather curious why you went to party.
Martin, your line's very bad. We'll come back to you. Morris in Woodbridge in Suffolk. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. I've only just tuned into the radio station, but obviously the biggest thing that interests me, again, when we're talking about housing, is why are we not building council housing? Because clearly council housing will offset the rental market, potentially bring that down, will potentially bring down housing prices. All we ever see is them build, let's build loads of houses, extortionate prices, and now we're facing that property crash where these housing people will clean up again. They've already sold the properties, and then people are going to end up in negative equity as we've seen before, and then, they clean up again?
Okay, so why are we not building more council housing?
I think you're absolutely right, Martin. I grew up in social housing. I think that because of the situation we're in now, for future generations to be able to afford to buy their own home, they're going to need to also have the opportunity. Many will need to have the opportunity to also live in social housing. We need to build more. So in the council where I'm a district councillor, we built a number of social homes. Homes England provides capital for councils and housing associations where appropriate to build social homes. And so the capital isn't necessarily the issue. The issue is the political will.
Well, you mentioned political will. I mean, Harold Macmillan, when he was housing minister years ago, that was when they were actually building hundreds of thousands of homes. Because it was a national strategy of the government at the time to do it.
And, Harold Macmillan is one of my political heroes, partly because of his role in fulfilling the targets set by Winston Churchill in the 1950s, right? And so you have to be able to say, look, I am the leader that's going to build homes, and everybody needs to coalesce around this mission. Private developers, local councils, financiers, etc.
But do you think, Samuel, that the mayor has got convening power?
100%.
Right. So you need to be able to put this front. Do you think that this is going to be a wedge issue in the London mayoral election contest next year?
Not if I'm not the candidate, bluntly, to be honest.
Very good.
Which is obviously very unlikely as of today. Don't go to William Hill and put any money on that one.
Thank you, Morris, for your call. Martin in Wandsworth, good evening.
Hi, Samuel. It's a quick question. I'm just curious to know why you want to represent a party that systematically uses social division, racial tension just to stay in power. Could you explain that to us?
Well, firstly, I don't think that the Conservative movement has a monopoly on trying to use division to try and maintain power. Unfortunately, that's just how our democratic system has functioned for many years. I think there is a better way. There is a way that you can inspire instead of trying to divide. There is a way that you can demonstrate that you're the most competent with the clearest plan and message. But unfortunately for many politicians, that feels like the more difficult way to do politics.
But Samuel, if you look at some of the language coming out from the Home Secretary, and we were talking about it in the first hour of the asylum policy of Rwanda, we're having a conversation around that. And irrespective of whether you agree with the Rwanda plan or you don't, some of the language coming out from some of the most senior politicians in this country, including the Home Secretary, a lot of people, including myself, would find it, to put it politely, uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I suppose that's partly because there aren't enough people saying, I'm going to stand up and say, this isn't right. Whenever I've stood up for something in politics, I've received plenty of messages and calls from colleagues who say, Sam, you've done the right thing. I completely agree with you. How many of those people have ever stood up and been counted? Not very many. And why is that? Because they're told that the way for you to progress politically is by not speaking out. It's just by you staying on message, towing the line, and eventually you'll get to where you want.
In this case, some politicians, some people would argue that politicians are actively seeking to stoke division and culture wars. And look, on the Rwanda plan in the last hour, I was saying myself that I still agree with it. I think the government should do something about it. So I'm not disagreeing with the plan itself, but the way that the language is used. But I want to pick up one thing you wrote in your book, you mentioned in the book as well, which is that You talk about racism and you talk about these issues that have pervaded for a long time, and you say it's not enough to be just against racism. You have to be anti-racist, actively anti-racist, which I found very interesting. And I wanted to explore what you mean by that and why it's important.
Yeah, so I think, I'm a conservative. And, when we were dealing with things like the response to the murder of George Floyd, etc., as I talk about in the book, I found myself in this conundrum where I felt like I was in the middle of this debate, and I didn't really know how to respond to that because I'm a black guy. I'm very proud of my heritage, and I know all the things that make me who I am, right? But at the same time, I wanted to really understand what was the British experience of race relations since 1948, etc., and where could we locate this moment in our own way. And it was only after I left and I spoke to so many different people on this journey of creating a book that my conclusion was actually for us to have a society where we can all function productively and feel included, we all needed to be a bit more proactive about how we were tackling some of the big issues of the day. We couldn't just afford to be quiet if it wasn't our own experiences, but we needed to do more to be part of the solution.
Keith, hold on. I'm going to come to your call in just a second, but I just want to keep this going for a little bit more on this race issue because Janet has texted in saying, "Hi, Ali. Samuel was and is an asset to the Tories who have not learnt any lessons on diversity or are not prepared to see people as individuals and see their contribution to society. Not everyone wants to belong to the old boys club. My question is, did Samuel quit after that disastrous race report?" Now, I think she's referring to the report by Tony Sewell into race disparities in the country. You had a view on that. You were involved in, I think, the selection of some of the commissioners. Mm-hmm. You're also very generous about Tony Sewell as an individual himself generally, although you had some concerns about him being appointed to that position to chair that particular commission, given his previous utterances around these matters. But what did you make of that report, Samuel? Because it's been reported that you were pretty uncomfortable when it came out.
Well, I'd already decided to quit before it came out. And in fact, I didn't read the report until the summer, a few months after I'd left, because I didn't really want to respond to people who wanted to ask what I thought about the report, because I had mixed emotions. And, on one side, I helped put together this commission. The Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, his intentions were very pure. He wanted this to be something that brought the country together and helped us to, I guess, take stock about where we were as a country when it came to things like race relations. And so I felt like it was a missed opportunity.
But why was it missed? What did they miss? Because one of the things that they were talking about was that race is not necessarily, they weren't ignoring racism, but they were saying it wasn't necessarily the primary factor that will determine your future, but class was a bigger issue.
Yeah, I mean, clearly race is, and racism still exists, but I think the conclusion that class plays a significant role in your outcomes was entirely true. Having said that, if somebody experiences racism, right, if somebody calls you or I a name, or if someone is an NHS worker with an accent who is struggling to be promoted in a foundation, etc., saying to them, well, to be honest, class is probably more of a significant factor in your experience, doesn't necessarily help them to get from A to B. And
you thought that they devalued the issue of race?
I don't think they did. I after I finally read the report, I felt like there were areas that could have been better explained, and there were some battles that they didn't need to have.
Interesting. Okay, let's go to our next caller, Keith in Upminster. Good evening, Keith.
Good evening. It's a sort of a two-part question.
Sure.
I'll try and make it concise. Assuming that the ULEZ expansion goes ahead this summer, and I'm hoping it won't, and it get postponed for a couple of years, if it does go ahead, do you think they should rerun the GLA referendum, which happened in 25 years ago, to create the GLA? Do you think?
So you say they should abolish the GLA
because they're bringing in ULEZ? Because the mayor wants to bring in ULEZ, you want the whole entire thing abolished, Keith? Is that right?
Yeah, if ULEZ extension goes ahead, then should we have a rerun of the referendum?
Keith is clearly not a fan. So.
Well, my running mate when I was still in the ring was a guy called Keith. He was a member of the GLA, so I'm not sure what his views on this would be. But on a serious note, we know that this ULEZ expansion is going to disproportionately impact some of the most vulnerable people in our city. And you remember some of the people who don't live in the city because they can't afford to, etc., still come in, they commute every day, come in to serve the people in the city, and they also drive cars that might not be ULEZ compliant. So
they also have to get their kids to school and go to their workplace.
Sometimes you have to even go to shop in a local supermarket, and you might end up having to pay £12.50.
Well, you were brought up in Barnet. In the suburbs, the bus services are not particularly reliable at all.
They could be a lot better, yeah.
They could be a lot better. And it's if you're living in zone 1 or 2, it's slightly different. You can get around very easily. But if you're living in the suburbs, it's completely different.
Yeah, and my challenge, I was a cabinet member for the environment, so I'm equally as passionate about the environment as Sadiq is. But my challenge with what he's doing here is he's not giving people much notice.
But are you going to cancel it if you were mayor?
I would if I was, yes.
Because I thought you said you were going to have a referendum in the different boroughs around it. So is your policy to actually cancel it?
We will. My policy was to find the best possible mechanism, and so if you think about it, the mayor at the moment has a budget where if he has planned for revenues of in excess of £1 billion because of this expansion, right? He's also spent £300 million.
Okay, because Rez has texted in saying, "Can you ask your guest whether he plans to cancel the ULEZ extension, please? It's causing people a lot of grief in only a few months."
Yeah.
Now,
So essentially, my position now would be that
would be to cancel it. Okay, so Rez can go and have dinner in peace now.
Rez can rest assured, yes.
Very, very good. Well, look, we've still got about 15 minutes or so. If you want to get a question into Samuel Kasumu about his book, The Power of the Outsider, which I'm holding up to the camera right now, then you're very welcome to do so. You might want to ask him about his time in Downing Street or why he wants to run for London Mayor or anything else on your mind. He's got a wealth of experience. He's served in government, so he knows what he's talking about. You can call 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, or you can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj in conversation with Samuel Kasumu in for Ian Dale. It's 8:46.
It's Colin Brazier on LBC.
Weeknights from 10.
Britain has lost control of legal migration.
Colin Brazier
35 years in journalism have given me a nose to be suspicious.
on your radio.
My husband is not going to be with me much longer because he refused to control his type 2 diabetes.
On Global Player.
My own experience of helping to raise my 6 children, I would try and row him behind whatever the teacher was saying.
This is LBC. This is LBC with Ali Miraj. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
It's Ali Miraj in for Ian Dale on LBC. I'm in conversation with Samuel Kasumu, a former advisor to Boris Johnson, number 10. He's written this book, The Power of the Outsider. Eddie says, Samuel, Ali, if Samuel wants to run for mayor, he shouldn't put that he was an advisor to Boris Johnson. I wouldn't vote for anyone who advised Boris Johnson. Nick in Barnet, good evening.
Good evening, gents. Hello, Samuel. I live in Barnet myself, actually.
Good man.
And I have to say that my opinion, the bus services are pretty good, but that's another story. Samuel, just a quick question. When you say that we need to build more houses, how are you going to supply the infrastructure?
Infrastructure.
To give you an example, where my friend lives in Hertfordshire. In a little village, Hertfordshire Council will put a proposal to build 300 extra houses on this village, which is full of country lanes and farm vehicles. And obviously the locals are up in arms about it, and they put a petition to try and stop this happening. So my question is that if you are going to build on brownfield sites or greenfield sites, how can you justify the infrastructure that's needed to supply these houses?
Yeah, infrastructure issue.
Really good question, and there are plenty of examples similar to what you have mentioned. Now, the thing is, when you plan for development, there are two things that you can qualify for depending on the size of the development. One is Section 106 money, and another is infrastructure levies, which are relatively new. And both of those things are designed to make sure that when you're building homes, the infrastructure comes. Now, there's a very logical debate around what comes first, the homes or the infrastructure, the chicken or the egg. But ultimately, what you need to ensure you have is a very clear plan for a whole region, which also accounts for where you're going to build homes and what infrastructure you need. They're called local plans. Now, what's happened over the last few months is that Michael Gove has said that it's no longer mandatory for you to have a local plan that meets your objectively assessed need. So they've taken away targets, which means that actually in the longer term, you're going to have speculative development or you're going to have no development. And also what you're probably going to have as well is a lack of planning for infrastructure. So my argument is you need the homes, but you also need the plan. And the plan must hit an objectively assessed need.
You're living in Welling Hatfield. That was one of the new towns that was completely planned.
Exactly.
Right? So we don't have that kind of vision at the moment. Now, in London, it's difficult because there is already... it's a sprawling city already, so it's very difficult to plan whole new towns of development within London. But more generally, I mean, there are places within London that you could actually have a vision which is infrastructure is built into the whole entire process, right? But it's not being at the moment.
Yeah, so you shouldn't just look at individual developments if you were a politician. You need to look at everything in the round. You need to say over the next 10 years, where can we have homes and what infrastructure do we need for that? And in terms of London specifically, when I look at what kind of homes do we need and where, I look at the whole London region. So that takes in the home counties as well, because I don't think it is logical for you just to say, well...
You're expanding your remit already. You haven't been elected
I'm trying
yet.
to take it all, But I think you have to plan looking beyond even the boundaries
people do
of London.
commute in, of course, right? And it affects the city. Thanks a lot for your question, Nick. Chloe in Croydon, good evening.
Good evening to you both. Samuel, whether you become mayor or not, or obviously it seems like you have your sights set in higher office, can you tell me what are your intentions to increase the attainment for young black males? So, for example, unemployment rate for young black men is 33% currently, according to current data, in comparison to 15% for young white men. The black men who leave in undergraduate degrees at university, well, black men and women, at nearly 70%. Yet they're so disadvantaged in the employment market. And I wonder if, I know from experience in a former life that when I say to employers, show me your resident labour market and what you did. And I said, well, why didn't you employ that person? Why didn't you employ that young man or that young?
Chloe,
and they come up with a myriad of excuses. And I think the same way we legislated for women in the workplace, that now women. There's a gender pay gap, and there's monitoring, and women. We're not quite there yet, but we're moving up the ranks. If there's some legislation which needs to take place,
Chloe, can I just ask you, when you're talking about black educational attainment and also then in the workforce, are you making any distinction between black African or black Caribbean, or are you making a general statement here?
Black British.
Okay, because they're very different, actually. If you actually look at the stats, you'll find that there is a difference. But anyway, Samuel, give your view.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's a need to be a bit more granular when you analyse that data.
I think it helps if it is.
And also by region. So, for example, like black African males do better in the east of England versus inner city London, etc. Really interesting, fascinating story. We know that if you are from an African background, you're more likely to go into higher education.
You see, it's interesting, right? Because if it's just skin color, right, then there's a distinction there. So then it's nice to try and delve a little bit deeper about why that's the case.
Well, there are a number of factors.
Yeah,
and so sometimes it's about when you arrived. And so if you arrived as part of the Windrush generation versus if you arrived when there was migration in the 70s and 80s, where you were located, the socioeconomic groups you're in when you arrived, etc., etc. Okay. That doesn't mean that discrimination still doesn't exist. And sometimes we run the risk when we explain, sounding like we're dismissing that fact. So we're not. But it's a complicated picture. I think ultimately what matters is role models and opportunity. We need to be able to go into schools and inner city areas and say to young people, well, actually, this is what you can achieve, and this is how you get there. And so, I'm completely passionate about the subject matter.
Okay. Chloe, thank you very much for your call. Sam in Lambeth, good evening.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Sam, what would you like to ask?
So I was just going to ask, we're talking a lot about housing when I don't think it's anywhere near the biggest problem we face in London at the moment.
What is, Sam?
We have a youth violence problem that is through the roof. Yep. We have stabbings in record numbers. Yep. We have people who don't feel safe in their homes. We have a government that doesn't actually give people the right to protect themselves under the laws. Look at someone like David King, who was recently convicted, even though he was just trying to defend his property. So what would you say people should do?
And are you talking particularly about crime in general or knife crime in particular in the capital?
Knife crime in the capital, but it's kind of spread out everywhere, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, indeed.
Liverpool, I think it's Manchester.
Sam's making a really key point.
Yeah, I had a big plan around how we were going to tackle crime. There's things we have to do around increasing trust and confidence with the Metropolitan Police. There's a lot more we have to do with communities around making sure that there is adequate provision for young people in boroughs across London. There's also more that we have to do around making sure that young people have access to role models, particularly male role models. You know, a lot of the times when you look at a young person that is involved in violent crime or counterline drugs, they're either maybe someone that has grown up in foster care or they've not had a direct access to a male role model. So there was a lot of work we wanted to do around that. I mean, even if I'm not a mayoral candidate anytime soon, it's still something I'm very passionate about.
Can I ask you, Samuel, your views around stop and search? Because obviously it's been raised as a big issue.
Yep.
There's an ongoing debate about it. What do you think the role of stop and search should be?
I think it's an important tool. It's not the answer to how we only in and of itself in terms of how we reduce violent crime on our streets, but it's important, and when it's done, it must be done in a respectful way that allows someone to have an element of dignity, and also where there are questionable stops, then people should be able to have adequate means for them to complain, and they need to have the confidence that their complaints will be looked into in a way that is integrous. But make no mistake, we don't keep our streets safe without having stop and search. You cannot, it's just not possible.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for your call, Sam. I'm going to just read this text out from David in Manchester. Ali, I like the sound of your guest, Samuel. He's a fighter. He doesn't give up. I admire that determination and belief in natural justice, characteristics we need in those in positions of leadership. Quick thought on that, Samuel.
You need to send that note to Greg Hans.
Do you think that the contest should be really reopened now, given the fact that there were only 3 candidates, one's dropped out?
Yeah, I mean, make no mistake, because I'm so outspoken, I'm not convinced that even if it was reopened, I would get anywhere near shortlist. But what I do think is, it's for us to make sure we have the best possible candidate to take on Sadiq Khan, which is important because we have so many big issues in our city.
Indeed.
We've got to reopen the contest.
Indeed. Samuel, it's been a fascinating hour discussing your book with you and so many other things as well. I wish you well. We all wish you well in whatever you do next. And if you want to buy this book that Samuel's written, again, final plug, The Power of the Outsider. It's a riveting read. I recommend it to you. Do go and dip into it and buy it. And you can always ask Samuel other questions via Twitter if you so wish. Samuel, thank you very much indeed for joining me this evening. Now, coming up next is a story about vaping. Now, this is, again, an issue that keeps pervading the news all the time. And it's reported that 8 Sleaford school pupils are in hospital after vaping, according to an MP. Now, this MP is Dr. Caroline Johnson, who said